And broadcast.
Is it better with the light on?
Yes.
Thought so. So handsome.
Look, it's Frank.
Yeah.
I got all mine right here.
Everybody's got their drinks. All right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Jessica. I'm one of the owners of Greenlight Bookstore, and we're excited to welcome you to our new online event series, Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. So for tonight's installment, they're going to be chatting with Eric Nusbaum about his new book, Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. So you're in for an excellent and interesting evening. Before we start, I just want to say a big thanks to everybody for making this happen, to Patrick for planting the seed of this idea, and to David for hosting, and to Eric for being here as well. Our bookstores are closed right now, but our community is still here, and it's great to be able to still make space for these kinds of conversations to happen. So we're grateful to everybody and to all of you for being here. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Because we're in a webinar, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you, but they can see your name so they know you're here. You can use the chat for sharing thoughts or just saying, hi, I'm here. If you have a question that you want to ask of Eric, we want you to use the Q&A icon. So you can click on that, put your question in there, and we're going to be getting to those towards the end of the event. If you see a really good question in there, you can also upvote it so the really good questions kind of float to the top. So you can add questions anytime during the event. We'll get to them at the end. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our website and social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Stealing Home, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com. Though our stores are closed, we're working with our supplier warehouse for fast direct-to-home shipping. So if you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. We're also, as an added incentive, offering 15% off on Stealing Home when you buy it from Greenlight's website this week. So look for the buy link and the coupon code in the chat. So our illustrious hosts for this evening and for the series are Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of and even more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn sports writing pipeline and happens to be my neighbor and friend. So hi, Patrick. David is a former editor at Deadspin. He previously worked at Vice Sports, and his writing has appeared in the New Republic, New York, Food and Wine, Hazlitt, the New York Daily News, and the New Yorker. He is not the David Roth from Van Halen or Magic, so clarifying. They're both going to be talking tonight with featured author Eric Nusbaum. He's a writer and former editor at Vice, and his work has appeared in Sports Illustrated, ESPN The Magazine, The Daily Beast, Deadspin, and the Best American Sports Writing Anthology. Born and raised in Los Angeles, he's also lived and worked in Mexico City, New York, and Seattle, and he now lives in Tacoma, Washington, where he's joining us from today. His new book, Stealing Home, is a story about baseball, family, the American dream, and the fight to turn Los Angeles into a big league city. So it's not every book that gets praised by the combination of Hidden Figures author Margot Lee Shetterly, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Moranis, and Chuck D of Public Enemy. But this is that book. So we are really fortunate to have Eric with us tonight. So Eric's going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then I'll be talking with Patrick and David and with all of you. So I will leave you to it. Eric, take it away.
All right, thank you for the introduction. I hope that I can live up to like an ounce of the people whose names are on the back of the book. Here is a little bit of a reading. It's from a scene in which the kind of main family in the book, the Aréchigas family, get forcibly evicted from their home by LA County Sheriff's deputies. By the time the deputies came up into Palo Verde, the Aréchigas family had gathered into the house at 1771 Malvina. This was the wood frame house with the handwritten protest signs out front. This was the house that Abrana had insisted would have Venetian blinds on the windows. It had the smells of her cooking baked into its walls, and decades of footfalls had left the wooden floors dull and smooth. The porch had been Abrana's domain for 37 years. This was the house where everything would end. Before the deputies arrived, the family nailed the door shut from the inside. The newsreel footage cuts from the squad cars to a line of deputies walking up the wooden steps to Abrana's porch. There are already photographers on the porch waiting for them. There's a bull's head mounted on the facade overhanging the steps. We don't hear it, but once the deputies reach the front door, there's an exchange between a Spanish-speaking deputy and the family inside the house. The deputies try to convince Abrana Manuel to leave the house peacefully. They plead, Finally, a deputy is called upon to kick the door in. He raises his boot, placing his hand on a companion's shoulder for balance. Slowly, he breaks the lock and the nails with his heel so that the door cracks open. However, it is also clear that the door is barricaded from the inside by something heavy. The deputies squeeze through a narrow opening into the crowded front of the house. Abrana stands before Captain Brady, the sheriff's deputy who has become the living embodiment of every uncaring official, manipulative lawyer, opportunistic businessman, and patronizing politician that she has dealt with over the years. In a threadbare black sweater and long skirt, she stalks the room as reporters and cameramen creep closer and closer. Flashbulbs illuminate the room one after another after another. She lays into Brady, who stands and takes it, looking down at her through his eyeglasses, his hands resting on his hips in a resigned sort of way. The newsreel footage has the quality of a silent film, and not just because it is silent. Abrana's gestures are sweeping, dramatic. The entire breadth and depth of her emotions seem to be contained in the simple flick of her wrist. You don't need to hear her to understand her. Manuel looks on, wearing a fedora and a striped short-sleeved shirt, and it almost seems like he is somewhere else. Tolina stands beside her mother, iron-faced, holding Ira, her 9-month-old. The wallpaper is decorated with flowers. Outside, utility workers climb the telephone poles running up Malvina and cut the lines. Movers emerge from their vans and work their way into the house, wearing matching white shirts. They begin to carry furniture down the stairs, one item after another, bed frames, cabinets, chairs, as fast as they can. A deputy rips out the front window so the movers can pass the furniture outside more quickly. They take a refrigerator that is filled with bottles of milk meant for baby Ira. All these possessions are bound for a storage facility somewhere else, somewhere not here. Then everything changes. I can keep going, but I can also stop there. I don't know. It's hard to read the room.
Yeah. I mean, I'm enjoying it.
I was in the video, if you didn't see, Eric put online, it's just 4 cops carrying a woman splayed down the stairs of her own home. And it's just this little black and white loop, but it is quite something. How long have you, actually, there's very few books, I think, that I've read that have a good origin story for the author. So tell us a little bit about how you got into it, thanks to this man right here.
Sure. So that man is Frank Wilkinson on the baseball card that Patrick just held up. He was a public housing official in LA in the 40s and 50s. And he visited my high school history class in my junior year of high school to talk about not really this story so much as his experience being blacklisted and the Red Scare. But part of that story was his advocacy for public housing in LA. And as a kind of vocal leader in the housing authority in Los Angeles, where he worked, and as a card-carrying communist, Frank got sort of stuck really the wrong place at the wrong time and was targeted by anti-public housing business leaders, you could call them, and famously outed as a communist at a hearing, which sort of derailed public housing in LA and led to eventually the construction of Dodger Stadium, but that's a long, complicated story.
He did say the one sentence to you that, like, Dodgers, say it exactly so I don't get it wrong.
Not exist. That was his, like, opening line.
Did you, how much did you know about this story, Dave? I sort of knew the broad strokes that they had destroyed some neighborhoods with working class Mexicans, but I didn't know anything about the public housing. I didn't know the ins and outs. How much of it did you know?
Very, very little. I mean, like you said, the broad strokes of, every baseball stadium, like they're not naturally occurring venues. And so they do tend to they go up wherever people can put them. And, in New York, there's that kind of, the Robert Moses story behind pretty much everything, where you can just sort of understand why Shea Stadium is where it is, for instance, back when Shea Stadium was there. In this case, I think that the thing that as somebody I went to school out in LA County, but far from Los Angeles itself. And Eric and I talked about this when we talked about this at the Brooklyn Historical Society.
I too did 2 years grad school, USC.
Yeah. Yep. That's way closer to actual Los Angeles than I was, man. I was basically, I had a 909 area code on my phone. So it was, but the way that I always sort of understood LA was as this like, you know, a place of hyper American sort of tumult and, you know, over statement in a way that I found kind of charming because I was coming from New Jersey, and, you know, like New Jersey's got the overstatement part, but not necessarily the other interesting stuff. And in reading the book, which I obviously enjoyed very much and recommend highly, I think that it did a really interesting job, not just telling that story, but sort of like illuminating what it means that a baseball stadium would wind up someplace on top of what had once been a neighborhood. Because like, I think I understood that was probably the case. And yet certainly, like, as you said, the idea of like, at some point that doesn't just happen because of laws being made or politicians making a deal. Like at some point it also involves cops carrying somebody out of their home.
Yeah, and also, like, I guess I should explain, if you haven't read the book, the like very quick outline of what happened is that there were these three communities that we now think of collectively as Chavez Ravine. And in the late 40s, they were slated to be the site of a massive public housing project, a really ambitious kind of utopian project that was on the verge of construction when this guy, Frank Wilkinson, was blacklisted and public housing was essentially kind of killed in LA. Most of the neighborhood was cleared out for that housing project. A few families held on and fought to get their land back. And that fight sort of ends with LA selling the land to the Dodgers and kicking out the final families to build the stadium.
What were the sense of what were the neighborhoods like? I mean, they were working class, but they seemed much more. I know sometimes we think of like probably because of public housing or, you know, sort of destroyed 80s neighborhoods, but it did not vibe that at all. It seemed like its own nice, almost small town.
Yeah, it was like three little towns, semi-rural in parts. You know, there was Elysian Park, which is still there, this massive park in LA that was kind of right jutting up against the neighborhood, a little bit removed from the city by geography, not a lot of ways in and out. And parts of them, you know, were shacks and grass, and parts of them were paved, normal neighborhoods that you would like, it would look like a suburb anywhere. Palo Verde, the kind of biggest neighborhood where the Aréchigas family lived, was a normal little neighborhood. It had a church and markets and an elementary school, and I mean, regular looking houses that a lot of the houses actually got moved to different parts of the city and just kind of blended into the atmosphere.
Did one thing you said, and I'm going to quote Twitter, which is always a bad idea, but somebody was said to you something along the lines of, there's like 4 hours of the Brooklyn Dodgers story in Ken Burns baseball, and it's official Squawkin Sports policy not to try to upset Doris Curtin's Goodwin, but zero about this story. And that seems insane. You said this is a better story, and I do think it is, but how did this sort of get lost? When you say in your book it was a national, I mean, people knew about it.
Yeah, people would, I mean, it was in the New York Times when the evictions happened. People were writing letters to LA politicians from all over the country. I think East Coast bias, pretty much. You know, there's this sort of thing where the people who write history, and especially baseball history, are like mainly from New York, and that's kind of how it goes. The story of the Brooklyn Dodgers, there was a lot of literature, a lot of tears shed, justifiably, about the Dodgers getting taken away. And the story of like a lot of complex political maneuvering and personal heartbreak that kind of preceded their arrival in LA is a little bit harder to tell. It's not as simple. And the victims are not as obviously part of the baseball narrative, the way that like a sad kid who loses his favorite team is very easy for like a sports writer to like write about. A family that didn't care about baseball, maybe not as much.
Yeah, there's something to, I think, in the book that the character of Walter O'Malley, who I grew up, you know, my dad was a Dodgers fan from New Jersey, but I mean, very much a fan of the team. And like, it wasn't the sort of thing where you weren't allowed to say O'Malley's name in the house or anything like that. But we were like, he was a villain. And I mean, I think that's like the way that he has generally been sort of spun here as the, you know, the guy that stole the sort of childhood legacy of all these people that would later go on to be on TV and talk about how Walter O'Malley stole their childhood legacy. And like the scope of his ambition in the book with moving the team and then also with Dodger Stadium is something that I was kind of startled by how new it was to me, given that, you know, Los Angeles is not an insignificant, you know, podunk burg. Like this is one of the baseball stadiums that everybody knows and recognizes. And yet like the reality of not just of how the stadium got there, but like the work and the vision that this one weird kind of not very pleasant man had for it is really kind of striking.
Although I always think, and not to focus on the Brooklyn Dodgers, one more thing though, but it's always amuses me that for all of Robert Moses' terribleness, he was right. A 52,000 geodesic dome where the Barclays Center now sits was a terrible idea. That thing would have been torn down by like 85 and just wasted money. So way to go, Bob.
I think it would look pretty tight though.
But that's kind of like the fundamental thing, right? I mean, the Robert Moses story is a big part of why the Dodgers left. Robert Moses really wanted them to move to Queens and play in what became Shea. And Walter O'Malley had an ego to match Robert Moses' ego, and he wanted to own his own stadium in Brooklyn. And that tension is pretty much the sort of reason that he left for LA.
One thing too, there's, you know, I guess politicians are always the same, but it struck me that you're talking about, on some level, there's a $17,000 appraisal for the house and a $10,000 city that's all they're going to pay. And that difference of money, at least from it sounds like the book, that had they offered them what they thought was, you know, fair value for their home, you're telling a totally different story. But it's such a small amount of money that seemed to play this massive role in the building of Dodger Stadium. Why didn't somebody just buy them off, or at least offer 15,000? I mean, why drag through that?
So Patrick's talking about the Aréchigas family, and their fight for their land was, in the end, it came down to a $10,000 offer from the city to buy it with eminent domain versus a $17,000 valuation that had been made on the property and appraisal that had also been made by the government. That was overruled. And at the end, as they're like waiting to get evicted, the scene I just read, they're insisting that if they just get paid the $17,000 and treated respectfully, they'll happily leave. But the city refused and refused and refused, and ultimately probably spent way more than $7,000 evicting them. The story is probably as simple as, why don't cities do things that are relatively easy to do to help marginalized people? I mean, I don't think there's any question that had their name been Smith, things would have been different. And when it comes to this story, you know, ultimately there were other families who were in a different position legally, and the city didn't have the legal status to knock down their houses. And those families got handsome payouts from Walter O'Malley himself, even though he didn't really have a legal obligation to pay them. But the city had screwed up the eviction process so badly, and screwed up probably by even giving O'Malley that land. So O'Malley just opens his checkbook at that point, having probably learned a lesson from the Aréchigas, and pays him.
Did it make either of you, one as a lifelong fan and one just as a baseball fan, did it make either of you think differently about the Dodgers, just in general?
I think it'd be better if Eric answered that one.
Not really. I mean, I kind of knew about the story. I think I'd already become a little bit cynical, or at least skeptical, about sports teams and stuff. And I think that the Dodgers are really just like a small tip of the iceberg on all the horrible things that happened in this book. I'm really not selling it very well right now. The book's really about like a societal failure. I don't want to say a systemic failure. It's almost like bigger than the system. It's an everything failure, and it's personal on many levels too. So yeah, I mean, it makes me rethink baseball and its place in the American imagination and like the kind of mythology of baseball. That's a big part of the book, sort of, I guess, like debunking that a little bit. But you also like, if you like baseball, you kind of like that stuff a little bit, or at least you're interested in it. So even as you're unpacking it or reading it more critically, there's a part of you that still is drawn to it.
There's something in the book that I found really interesting. I mean, I think that's a fair assessment of the book. I don't know if you've read it, Eric, but you did pretty well. But there's an element there too of like the sort of the narrative tension of the book. And again, for people that haven't read it, it moves around a lot in time, and it tells the stories of, different people living very different, but like sort of parallel lives, and as they sort of draw closer together in this way. But the narrative tension of it is really a matter of like power winning out, and the process of like sort of there's a sort of a dread at as it gets closer and closer to the moment the stadium gets built, what happens to these neighborhoods, and yet it's just a matter of sort of the process of watching history happen in the way that it happens, and then kind of filling in the blanks with that. Storytelling wise, I'm curious if I asked Eric about this previously, but that like, how do you go about telling a story that has this sort of known ending and even some other sort of like known dimensions in a way that isn't just, from the perspective of whatever, a fan or a baseball historian?
I mean, I think it's the same way you would tell any story, which is you have to tell it through people's lives. I think, stuff happening, but like stuff happening to people and then people making stuff happen to themselves is what's interesting. I probably read a lot of fiction and thought about novels and short stories and how the sort of, how dialogue will drive exposition and how one event leads to another. And I tried to show how the choices that people made affected their lives and affected the lives of other people, I guess. And not just have it be like static history. I tried to sort of let the events, kind of the logic of the events, be the logic of the book. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Did you have an idea of, it's just such sort of an LA way of telling stories, shortcuts is the obvious one, but the sort of the sprawl of the city and the disparate characters all sort of building to that thing. Was that something you thought of beforehand? Did it just kind of work out that way that there are other, I mean, I guess Amores Perros is not LA, but same sort of storytelling style. And I don't know, it reminded me of that kind of thing that's been very popular in the whenever.
Yeah, I kind of knew I was going to do it sort of like that. The book that I think I looked at the most was the USA trilogy by John Dos Passos. He does this thing where he has these main characters he follows, but then he jumps to like these like weird biographies of historical figures at the time. George Packer did something kind of similar in The Unwinding recently, which he said was copying Dos Passos too. So maybe I stole from
Pretty good company
a little bit. Well, I mean, I literally just like barged in. They didn't invite me. So that was a little bit of it. I also knew I really wanted to just like tell the story of Frank Wilkinson and the Aréchigas family in a way that sort of gave you that sense that they're going to meet eventually, and that meeting was going to be significant.
Did you know sort of from the outset, did you ever think you were going to write more about baseball? Was ever a thing? I mean, you do follow the Davis story, but did you ever think like at a point, like I want to tell the first few years of the Dodgers when they won, what, 2 or 3 World Series, right? In their first.
Yeah, 59. I mean, they did really well. They were very good. I at some point pretty early on, I decided that the book was going to end when the stadium opened in '62. And that was like, it just seemed like the right place to end the book. The book's about the events leading up to the stadium and the construction of the stadium. And then going beyond that would have been stretching. There's been really good books about the Dodgers after Dodger Stadium. The Last Innocents by Michael Leahy came out a few years ago. They Blood Blue by Jason Turbo. There's really good books about that already. So I didn't really feel like I needed to get into it.
Was there, one of the you know, I love when you find these crazy details, but the most LA detail to me, I think, in the whole book, or at least the glamour LA that people condescend to, was the telethon. I just love celebrities hosting a telethon for a wealthy baseball owner to take a bunch of land. So I don't know, just talk about that or other quirky LA things that you turned up. They're like, yes, this is good.
Yeah, I mean, the telethon is interesting because it's sort of like the culmination of like the media influence on all these events. And so the telethon in 1958, after the Dodgers moved to LA, right after, there was a ballot referendum over whether or not they could legally buy this land that became Dodger Stadium, because the land had been acquired with eminent domain. So it theoretically was supposed to be used for a public purpose. So there was this huge legal battle. It ends up with a popular vote in the city. And in order to win the vote, Walter O'Malley, the owner of the Dodgers, buys like a big block of TV. I don't even know if he bought it. He got it for free from KTTV, which is now Fox 11 in LA. And they have this giant telethon where O'Malley and like, I don't know, Ronald Reagan and every celebrity you can possibly imagine is out there saying how great baseball is. And it ends with like the Dodger team plane landing at LAX and all the fans rushing to meet them. It was a very dramatic made-for-TV moment. And it's also like relevant to the LA stuff. And this is like early days of TV. KTTV was owned by the Chandler family, who owned the LA Times. And the LA Times was just like, you can't overstate how instrumental in killing public housing in LA and in being boosters for the stadium deal. I mean, like, they were truly like a wing of government. Like, they were a total propaganda machine in every single sense.
Yeah. And like breathtakingly reactionary. The stuff that you have in the book from them, just the sort of bits of LA Times coverage are like, I knew that it was a very conservative paper, you know, like now it is like one of the really good American newspapers, but I knew that it reflected whatever. Chandler had some sort of pretended military rank. Is that right?
That was his father-in-law.
Oh, okay.
That's great.
But they were old-fashioned money creeps, like of the old line. But the way that sort of the only people I think that really wind up getting, I guess powerful people wind up getting what they want more than the non-powerful people in this book, as in other books that I've read. But there is like something about the way that the power structure works in this book is really sort of fascinating and I think really well drawn. The way that real estate developers and politicians and the police and whatever, sort of how they bend things their way. Was there something, I mean, obviously you care about Los Angeles a lot. You lived there for your whole early life. Was there stuff that surprised you about how power worked in LA in this, or was it really more just sort of pulling the thread and finding more of, you know, whatever the Chinatown-y expected?
It was way worse than I thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I guess that was what surprised me. I knew the history of LA-ish. You know, I'm from LA. I like history. I was living in LA when I wrote the book, and it was just like it was way more transparently out there that like the city was being controlled by landowning sort of like plutocrats. Like, it was just like, this is how it is, and we are not ashamed of it, and we're gonna just like use all of our money and power to buy the media and by literally just like pay off politicians, which is happening right as we speak at LA City Hall again. But I was amazed by how unsubtle power was as it was wielded in the city.
Yeah.
How much of it was cloaked in? My dad grew up in Los Angeles. Went to Hollywood Stars games right near, I guess, what is now Television City, I believe.
Yep, CBS.
And he, last year I did a thing on a book about the building Disneyland. I sort of asked him about it, and he was kind of saying that at that time, he was a teenager, it just like, you started to believe that LA was, the place to be. Like, this really was a new frontier. You know, Beach Boys are happening, Disney World, movies, and the Dodgers stadium kind of fit into that. And I wonder how much they were able to sell that message, but how much did the town, which was nowhere near the size of it is now, sort of buy into that baseball is going to be part of this sort of new West Coast utopia. The traffic jams were not a thing yet.
Yeah, actually, one of the advertising materials that they had for the Proposition B campaign in '58 was that like there will be no traffic at Dodger games. That was like one of their selling points, which is extra funny now.
Why?
Yeah.
Where's the monorail?
He tried to build that monorail. I think it was not like something everybody agreed on in LA, right? So O'Malley's measure won 52% to 48%. Baseball existed in LA before the Dodgers. Like the Pacific Coast League was really good. It was high quality baseball. There was popular teams. There were really good players coming out of that league all the time, and players who were choosing to play there instead of the majors at times. So it wasn't like LA was this like backwater who needed baseball, but there was a sense that like, especially among politicians, that LA should be a major league city. And it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess. LA was huge. It was already bigger than most major league cities. It was maybe the third or fourth biggest city in the country already by the late 50s. And there was a lot happening in Disneyland and Dodger Stadium and these big places. It was sort of the kind of idea that you could create your own, utopia in LA. And I mean, Walter O'Malley sent his staff to go to Disneyland and look at it. He corresponded with Walt Disney. Like there was an actual thread tying these things together.
I think we should and touch on this because of now and because of always. The straight up racism, I don't think we've addressed that enough. There's a passage I put on Twitter about a cop, and I will quote, "If I had my way, I'd chain all of you fucking Mexicans and march you into the ocean, all of you." So how much of that community just suffering from neglect and no one giving a shit is part of the story of the Dodgers?
I mean, it's the story of LA, and the Dodgers are part of the story of LA. The community exists, Palo Verde, let's say, is the main one in this book because of redlining laws, pretty much. Because if you're Mexican, you can't buy a house in other parts of the city. And then as the city develops and as this community develops, it's neglected by the city government and it's not given the resources it needs to survive. It struggles to, get bus service. It struggles to really do anything it needs to do. And that's because of racism. So when the officials come to say it's substandard to build a public housing project, that's because of decades of racism that led up to it. And the reason that people are okay with a housing project there is because of racism, and on and on and on it goes. It's pretty central to the whole story.
And what has there been any different? I was curious about this. Is there any difference in the story? And I don't know how closely you've covered it, and I actually know nothing about it. But with the building of the new stadiums in LA right now, has there been similar? I mean, there's always shenanigans, but this Rams and Chargers, whatever, and it's in Inglewood, right?
It's Inglewood.
Is history repeating itself to some degree, or no?
Sure. I mean, what you have ultimately is really, really powerful rich guys deciding how poor people, mostly non-white poor people, are going to live, and like changing their neighborhoods, pricing them out of their neighborhoods. It's the same story. It's a little different, right? The public housing element's not there. It's not as convoluted this time. If anything, it's sort of just like, we know who's in charge of LA, and ultimately we know who the government's going to back up, and we know who's going to benefit from these projects. And it's probably not the residents, and it's probably not homeowners in the area, and it's probably especially not renters in the area.
Yeah, there's this back and forth in, that you talk about in terms of the housing and the anti-communism and stuff, in terms of in both cases, the people that lived in Palo Verde were not being left alone to sort of determine their own lives. But the housing project that you talked about that Wilkinson had pitched was super sprawlingly ambitious. I mean, as ambitious in its own way as Dodger Stadium was itself. And that sort of counterweight to the like old-fashioned heavy-handed power boy shit is just not in the equation anymore, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's like a very generous reading to Frank Wilkinson, because his vision was extremely problematic too. Like,
yeah, and it was being imposed on people just as surely as everything else. Yeah,
right. An appropriate, not slum housing here. Like, the idea of telling somebody else how to live in a really paternalistic way is wrong. And I would say there's like an optimistic side to that, which is I think that the sort of progressive movements have aligned in LA. So people who would, I mean, somewhat. There's the beginning of like an alignment. You know, people who want more housing in LA are also starting to become cognizant of the fact that building a bunch of new housing in LA is probably going to really impact and affect and gentrify neighborhoods. And there's a discussion about it, at least now. It's out in the open. I think that's a good thing. I don't think we're really getting anywhere, but at least it's being talked about. Man, yeah, it's brutal.
Have you been worried about the city, like just sort of watching it from afar? Like, how have you been feeling about Los Angeles of late? This is not to do with the book. I'm just asking you as a friend.
Yeah, I'm worried about it. I mean, I left LA, for people who don't know, like 6 months ago. Our family moved to Tacoma, pretty much where my wife is from, and we used to live in Seattle, and I love it up here. But it's strange to watch on TV as like LA sort of struggles to find its footing. I think you're seeing like a pretty like lost city in terms of leadership. Like, the mayor clearly doesn't really have control over what's going on. He's sort of waffling. Probably New York people feel similarly about that.
No,
And,
we love our guy.
Oh, you'd say
Yeah.
Really popular, I think, universally, right? So, and I mean, God, there's like a coronavirus outbreak at the Inglewood Rams Stadium right now. That's like,
wow.
How bad things are in LA. Like, the construction, there's like 150 cases among construction workers because they've been building the thing this whole time.
Is Todd Gurley okay?
I don't think he's been around.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. One thing they've, you read this and then your mind kind of goes to another place, and that is, and I have not been there in more than 10 years, but I can't imagine it's changed that much. Dodger Stadium is a real jewel. Like, it's one of the best places to see a baseball game, if not the best. And it's just sort of, when you're there, even knowing this now, if I went there, I'd be like, they really got this right. And but the passage of time will do that to you.
I mean, they got it right. It's a beautiful stadium. It's perfect. It suits the environment really well. It's 60 years old, and it's like feels. I mean, they've done a nice job updating it, but it's incredible. Like, O'Malley had a vision and he executed it, and he was totally right on. Like, he knew that a baseball-only stadium was the thing to build at a time when everybody else is building multi-purpose stadiums that died horrible deaths, pretty much. He knew that something privately built with the help of like a pretty generous land deal from the city and a bunch of infrastructure with a singular sort of architectural vision would hold up better. He saw the future of like family-friendly parks with wide concourses and open concourses. And, he missed on some stuff like the parking and lack of transportation, but the stadium itself, once you're inside, yeah, it's incredible.
Have you sensed any momentum or any willingness, I guess, on the part of the organization to acknowledge what was there before the stadium was? And I mean, obviously reparations are kind of off the table, but I mean, have they shown any inclination to give the former communities of Chavez Ravine their due?
No. There was
Next question.
There was in 2000, I think, there was an olive branch ceremony conducted by the Fox ownership of the Dodgers at a little church near Dodger Stadium, where they literally like handed olive branches.
Not a metaphor.
They were in the community, and like they had like a certificate and said, "We acknowledge this," and that was it, as far as I know. There hasn't been any acknowledgement. They don't talk about it on tours of the stadium. They don't talk about it at all. I will say the O'Malley family, who were the Dodger owners at the time, if you go to the Walter O'Malley website, they talk about it. they you know, they have a perspective on it, which is fair, but like they don't pretend it didn't happen.
You get to watch a game with Larry King. Here's a Dodger dog. Merry hearts.
That's the dream.
Right there.
I mean, Larry, have me on your podcast if you're watching.
What's how's this book has been out for a little while. How's it doing? And have you heard from you know, I mean, the LA Dodger community of the last X amount of years have you heard from a lot of people just sort of randomly not knowing the story, wanting to know more about this story?
Yeah, it's gone pretty well, I think. It's been out since March 24th, so coming up on 3 months. It's hard times weird right now. You know, 3 months where I've been inside the whole time. So I'm excited to get to like a bookstore and see it on a shelf and have that experience at some point. I think the Dodger community has been really positive so far. People have been really friendly on social media, you know, emailing me, whatever it is. I'm happy about the response to the book. I'm happy people are reading it.
And did have you connected with the Mexican-American Dodger community? And I'm curious, were the fans, were they instantly, did they have a big Mexican following when the Dodgers came? Or was there, I mean, obviously Fernando Valenzuela was huge, but that's 20 years later. What's the relationship been? I know it's a broad question, but between the Dodgers and the Mexican LA community?
That's a big question. I would say that it's been pretty good lately. The Dodgers have a huge Mexican and, you know, diverse fan base. One of the things that O'Malley did when he came to LA was he set up Spanish language radio for every game. And he made a big point to embrace having women and kids come to his games. And at the time, in like the 50s, like ball games were very much like men in suits and stuff like that going to watch. He really wanted to be appealing to everybody. Obviously, the like nature of the construction of the stadium didn't help, but the Dodgers have always like sought to, and for business reasons, I wouldn't say it's because of like any moral like tendency towards like doing the right thing necessarily. They've always sought a big, broad fan base.
Is the stadium, tell me about the updates that having not been there, what they are keeping it up. There isn't a move to get rid of it, or we need to modernize it.
They actually put a ton of money into it this offseason, and they were kind of like changing it. So the outfield pavilions used to be separated from the rest of the stadium, so you had to enter them separately. It was like this kind of, I don't know, quirk that I liked about Dodger Stadium, but now it's all going to be enclosed. There was never like a single entrance, like a grand entrance to Dodger Stadium. There's one now in center field, but it's all been closed. So I don't know what it looks like. I've seen drone footage like on Twitter, but that's the extent to which I can.
I've seen drone footage on Twitter. That's
Yeah, that classic no baseball thing. That's what we're doing. Everybody's watching their own stuff. I watched some KBO games. Eric's really into drone stuff, which I support.
I am strictly want to get to the bottom of the Mets trading Justin Turner.
I'm not ready to talk about that. So
former Billings Mustang, Justin Turner.
Really? Yeah.
Yes, he was. He was a Red.
He was a Cal State Fullerton Titan. That's what I think of him as.
And a member of the Dr. Teeth band from the Muppet Show as well. A lot of people don't know that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it looks like one of the guys. Should we take questions? Is it time to take questions?
Let me show you this video, Jess, real quick, and then we'll take questions. Since
Ready?
the book does wrap up with Fernando. I wanted to play you this clip because I just want to know if you've ever heard this Vin Scully call.
All right, here we go. Bear with me. There we go.
There was a short chant, Pedro, Pedro, as they did in Boston in the '86 World Series to try and taunt Strawberry. And now they're doing it to Guerrero, hoping to distract him, hoping to upset him, hoping perhaps to make him try too hard. Fernando ready, and the strike two pitch is hit back to the box, dribbling to second. Samuel on the bag, throws to first, double play. Fernando Valenzuela has pitched a no-hitter at 10:17 in the evening of June the 29th, 1990. If you have a sombrero, throw it to the sky.
Kind of killed the vibe at the end there. Kind of fucked it all up, actually.
I was gonna say the 80s. It wasn't even the 80s, but Saint Vin.
He said that a couple times in Fernando's career. I think, like his rookie year, like 81. I think that was a famous call too. Maybe I'm just conflating it, but yeah.
That's unfortunate. That there's a lot of real good stuff right up until that gets kind of cringy. There's Mike Sharperson, Juan Samuel.
Fernando's glasses.
Those are high performance sports glasses.
Burrito posture, holding the radar gun.
Also, kind of a startlingly thin Tommy Lasorda.
Yeah. And he was moving. I mean, he ran. He usually took him a while to get out of the dugout.
Yeah. I was excited.
Right. I will ask you this question, and I meant to do this, and I did not, but I will because I'm very interested in it. Have you heard the Rycooter album, Chavez Ravine? What about which is about to take over, and what do you think of it?
Yeah, I've heard it. Listened to it a fair amount. I think it's cool. I like that he incorporated all these great LA musicians into it. I reached out to him a couple times when I was writing the book, thinking like, oh, I should meet Rycooter. He did not respond.
It's a concept album,
it's like a concept album. It's like kind of telling the story. He, like some like classic songs and some songs written about like, there's a song called Third Base, Dodger Stadium, like about like a guy whose house was supposedly at third base. And it sort of sprawls into some pretty like weird, spacey, like ambient music. It's weird in a good way.
When's it from?
Early 2000s probably.
Oh, wow. All right. Because that has a very like 1983 sort of vibe. Like what you're describing is definitely like just one of those pharmaceutical visions that was coming out of the music industry at that time.
But it's a pharmaceutical vision. Like if you want like great like legendary Chicano musicians and songs about UFOs, like this is your
yes I do.
I think that would be great, actually. So this is I'm just gonna go ahead and read this, not because it's a question that you need to answer, but just because I enjoyed reading it and I thought you might like seeing it too. From Elliot Tucker: is it true that Eric is like ridiculously tall, like 6'2" with Mike Dunleavy Jr. arm span? Why is he writing a book and not helping LeBron win another ring? I just I'm glad that people out there that have maybe never met you know that you're tall.
I'm tall. I'm 6'3"-ish.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I have Mike Dunleavy arm span, but I haven't measured his arms lately.
Yeah, I think it's fine to, even if you did, it's not the sort of thing that you'd probably brag about.
It's almost.
I've never seen you in person, so I'm gonna have to take your word for it.
He's even better looking. Can I read a question, Patrick?
Absolutely. Dreamy.
Eric, this is from Ron himself, Aaron Gordon. Do you think the public housing project that was planned for Chavez Ravine would have worked, however you want to define that? Or was it too utopian for its time and place?
No, I don't think it would have worked. I think it would have been like starved of resources and ultimately redeveloped to become condos and like a mixed use development or something like that.
Yeah, it had that. It was a star architect, Richard. I don't know how to say his name right, but
I don't either. No, I say Nitra, but I think it's Neutra. It's
Neutra. He's like one of the architects whose names people know.
He is like one of the definitive LA architects. It would have been cool. And the housing project was really beautifully rendered. Like it was going to be these cool towers overlooking a hill. One of the architects called it an acropolis. Like it would have been like a Greek acropolis for LA. But it's just really hard to imagine the way LA politics were and are, that a housing project like that would have been well funded and sustained, and that big business interests wouldn't have just went out and like killed it eventually and turned it into a mall.
Right. I mean, that's like, in some ways, like it sounds like the first version of what has since become like the single most predictable thing about every stadium project, which is that the first rendering that you see where there's dolphins here, like how happy everybody is, like, and what you wind up getting is like a fucking rainforest cafe in a dreary mall with a big stadium around it, surrounded by parking lots. Like, I've been thinking about that with the Barclays Center in the last weeks, because that's become, I mean, that was one of the ultimate examples of that for me, that it was this super crazy ambitious Frank Gehry project that wound up being like nothing remotely like that. I mean, that was like what you did to get the tax credits. And yet, because of the activism, it actually has become like an important part of like Brooklyn's civic life, weirdly.
Yeah, they're building, doing the parental math. We realized Molly would be in 8th grade, so it's probably not going to work. And I assume COVID is pushing it back a year, but they're opening a 700 student middle school that's currently under construction on the Barclays, whatever the layout is. And that will be like there'll be kids everywhere walking around in Spencer Dinwiddie jerseys, presumably he's fixed. But yeah, it has become much more of a, like, this is going to be a real part of town, which is strange because
it was like not really anything that was sincerely intended, I think,
No,
on the part of the
not at
people
all.
that were developing it.
But it'd be cool if they built like a middle school on top of the garden.
Yeah, I mean, anything that goes there would be nice. Can I read another question, Patrick, or do you
Yeah, go
want to
ahead.
read it? All right. So how were you able to track down community organizers and Chavez Ravine residents at the time, all these decades later, for interviews?
They're extremely tight-knit. The people who live there have maintained a kind of familial connection all these years later, which is pretty remarkable considering most of the community was gone by like 1952. They have a picnic every year at Elysian Park, right across from the stadium in July. I don't know if this year is going to happen, unfortunately. But so it wasn't too hard to like find the group. And then it was just a matter of like earning people's trust and making lots of pestering phone calls, all the things that you have to do if you're a reporter. You know, trying to talk to people and trying to learn and listen and begin to comprehend a little bit what it's like to have your home raised to build a public housing project, and then ultimately have that public housing project kind of bait and switched on you to make a baseball field. So it wasn't that hard to begin to track them down. And then the harder part was sort of like getting and kind of like earning the respect and trust of the people who live there.
How much of the book was first person research versus archives? Did you learn a lot, or would you learn more from, or was it equal? Was it how much did you learn just in the interviews?
It depends on who. Like a lot of the historical context is from archive stuff. You know, the communities, Palaverde, La Loma, and Bishop weren't like well archived. There's not like a library collection of letters and archival material from those places. They were pretty much underdocumented and not really like valued by society. And so a lot of it's oral tradition, a lot of it's families who have, you know, kept records and old letters. A lot of it's looking at like censuses and things like that. When it comes to like Frank Wilkinson, you know, he like literally left a 10,000 page oral history and a 100-page FBI file.
Is that where you got the prostitute story?
That was from his oral history. He loved to tell that story. He was a character, Frank. So it was a combination. I mean, archival research about politicians, also reading books. You know, there's a lot of really good scholarship on mid-century LA, and I tried to read as much of it as I could.
Is there anything that you would recommend to people who were interested in learning more about Los Angeles?
Depends what like element of the book you're interested in, I would say.
Yeah, that this was like, I mean, the one that, because it's like something I read in college was City of Quartz, but there's, I mean, were there books that you came across in reading about this that you were sort of, that you had not known about previously, that you were happy to make the acquaintance of?
Yeah, one of my favorites is a book called Fritz B Byrne and the Development of Los Angeles. And it's like a very like simple, straightforward biography of this real estate developer named Fritz Burns. But he lived an incredible life, and his story and influence on like housing and development in America was huge. He was just a fascinating person who I'd really never heard of until I started researching this book. So that book's by a guy named Jim Keene. I would recommend it. Fritz Burns and the Development of Los Angeles. There's
some classic, as a longtime reader and fan of your work, there's some very good Eric Nusbaum understatement in telling his story, because it is outlandishly, he lived on the beach, he went bankrupt a bunch of times and stuff like that. And pack a lot of that into one paragraph with like basically no adjectives in it, just kind of like doing that Eric thing. It's very gratifying to read.
Material speaks for itself.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one last question, which I think is really interesting. The family, and I keep saying the family because I do not want to say the name wrong. So they had public sentiment on their side, and then people found out, oh, they're actually smart investors in property. They own, I think it was 7 homes. And then the tide turned against them, which is somehow crazy that you get both the pull yourself up by the bootstraps crowd doesn't like you, nor does the, well, we need to paternalistically take care of them because they're poor, when actually they're not. They're just smart and own property. And that seems to me sort of it's almost the definition of neoliberalism, and came out of LA, because the future has come from LA since the 50s.
Yeah, I mean, you guys talked about racism before. This is racism. So the Aréchigas family had property, and after they were forcibly evicted on TV from their home, it came out in a newspaper that they owned their property, and public sentiment shifted against them because they were sympathetic when they were desperate with no place to go, but when it turned out that they were actually taking a political stand, people seemed to not really want to hear that, to say the least.
We're about done here. I want to hold up once again. That's Frank Wilkinson. This is the book, Feeling Home.
Wait, there's
one. It's really good. I'm going to say that about every book, but I won't be necessarily telling the full truth. But this book is excellent. You said it's one of your favorite baseball books of all time.
Yeah, I mean, it's barely a baseball book. I just think it's like really grown and smart, and I recommend it to everybody. And Eric's a good writer. And as I mentioned earlier that he was tall, but it seems worth mentioning again.
Very tall authors. There aren't that many good tall authors, as far as I know.
Oh my God, yeah.
Jeff Goldblum have a book out?
The Short Man's Game. Kareem is a good writer.
Yeah.
Before we go, the book, Jess forgot to mention in the intro that Greenlight is also donating a percentage of all book sales online to the Legal Aid Society. There's some stuff going on outside, perhaps you've heard about, and that's a good way to spend your money. And before she comes back on, June 25th, we will have a totally different baseball conversation with Michael Stahl, author of Bartolo Colon, in his own words, the best fat baseball player since Honey Bear Rayford, and the best fat two-family guy since Charles Kuralt. So thank you, Eric, and thank you, Dave. And Jess, you want to take us out?
Yes, thank you guys so much for another great conversation. Patrick, thanks for the reminder about June 25th. So we hope you'll join us again. Eric, thanks so much for being with us and for this great story. It was good to listen in tonight.
Thank you for having me. This is fun.
Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
The link to buy the book is in the chat and the discount code. So we hope you'll support Eric and have a great night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.